Welcome to this episode of The Humanitarian. Today I sit down with Dr. Amy Black to discuss USAID. A professor at Wheaton College in Illinois, Dr. Black earned her PhD in political science from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and her research ranges from the correlation of religion and politics to the presidency and Congress. She's a former president of Christians in Political Science and served as an American Political Science Association Congressional Fellow in the office of Representative Melissa A. Hart. Dr. Black has also authored many books over the years, including Honoring God in Red or Blue, Approaching Politics with Humility, Grace, and Reason, and Beyond Left and Right, Helping Christians Make Sense of American Politics. Today we will try to break down the legal questions surrounding the shutdown. Does the president really have the power to halt foreign aid? Is it in the U.S. best interest to continue aid programs? And we also answer listeners' questions. All this and more, up next. You are listening to The Humanitarian. Hello, Dr. Black. Welcome to the podcast.
Great to be with you.
First, I'd love to cover the question, what is the legal definition for foreign aid, just to start out so we can have that definition, and then how much does the U.S. government spend on this aid annually?
Sure. So we use the term foreign aid a lot. That's kind of the common term that you'll read in the newspapers and just in sort of everyday language. The official term is U.S. foreign assistance. You can see how foreign aid is a little bit easier. But foreign assistance is a broad category, and it's talking about voluntary transfers of money, goods or services from the U.S. to another country. And it includes two forms, military aid and humanitarian aid. Often when we're talking about foreign aid, we're talking about that humanitarian aid side, but we do have both of those. In fiscal year 2023, just for example, 88% of our foreign aid was for those economic purposes and only 12% for military purposes. So most of our foreign aid is going to economic assistance. It's a little hard to get current numbers, but the best numbers we can probably get are back to 2023. But we spent around $65 billion on foreign aid, which is about 0.2% of our GDP in 2023. And of that, USAID, which does most but not all of our economic assistance, managed about $40 billion. And just to give us a sense of that, $40 billion in 2023 was about 0.7% of the federal budget, so less than 1% of the federal budget.
Okay. Well, I just talked to Matthew Sorens in the last episode, and he mentioned that people think that it can be as high as 25%, 50% of the budget, but in fact, it's less than 1%.
When you ask people, that's very common, somewhere between 20 and 30%. When people make a guess, they have no idea that it's such a tiny fraction.
And another question I think I keep hearing is keeping foreign aid in the U.S. interest, because there's now this whole policy of America first. Is keeping foreign aid, in fact, in the U.S.'s best interest?
Sure, and in some ways it makes wait, so shouldn't we spend all our money here for our people? And you hear that argument, and I think there's a reason to ask that question. But when we dig a little bit deeper, I would argue that foreign aid tends to be, and probably is very much, in the U.S. best interest. It's a relatively low-cost investment, if we're talking like less than 1% of our budget, but there's high potential for rewards. And I'm not to claim that every aspect of foreign aid always works and gives us rewards, but just to give you some ideas, some of the things that we as academics find when we study foreign aid, it tends to help reduce poverty internationally, which I would say is a good thing. It aids in economic development. It helps countries to prosper. So that's a good thing. It also, at least U.S. foreign aid, is expanding democracy and trying to expand access to free markets, which is something that we believe is the best system for people. There's also, when you expand democracy, when you help address poverty, when you aid in economic development, what does that mean? Nations are typically more stable. And so what we find is over the years, this kind of investment tends to lead to political stability. So then we have a less likelihood of terrorism, a less likelihood of war. So this kind of economic assistance is far cheaper than trying to send military, both in money and also in, American lives. We also find that when we do this kind of aid, it often increases our trading partnerships. If you're helping developing countries build their economies, they're better able both to create goods that we might want as coming to us, but it also creates more markets for us for our exports. So it can build trade that way. And then finally, we can't really measure this so much, but I would argue that foreign aid actually has indirect rewards for us. When we forge alliances around the globe, when we build reputation as a trusted partner, and people think the U.S. is here to help us, the U.S. is on our side, that's something you can't really maybe monetize, but I think that's something that's really important for keeping us, sort of our space in the international order, being seen as a positive player and someone who contributes.
And so would you say that foreign aid is a prudent investment for the United States, a moral question, or would you say both to some extent?
To some extent, it's both. I think for the modern history of foreign aid comes out of the post-World War II experience. We have the Marshall Plan when we help rebuild Europe. Why would you help rebuild Europe? It's not our problem. Well, actually, we were part of that war, and by rebuilding Europe, we're helping them get to stability, so maybe we won't have another war. So there's kind of this sense of it's prudent, it makes sense, but then there are also these moral pieces to it. So one piece is, to what extent should a very wealthy nation like the United States, do we have a moral obligation to share some of that wealth with the poor? That is, I think, an open question. It's a debated question. I don't think every person would absolutely say yes. But if we look at, for example, the international community, the United Nations has an expectation that advanced nations should spend at least 0.7% of their gross national income on international aid. So when we see something like that, we get a sense of this is something that the United Nations believes that, again, it's for advanced nations, for those who have the richer nations to be able to give back, if you will. I think as Christians, I think this connects to the concept of what does it mean to care for the least of these. And when we are called by Jesus to care for the least of these, again, we can sort of argue, are those least of these just the ones nearest to us? Should this be a global question? I do think that that's a legitimate question to ask, but this idea of caring for the least of these, that's something absolutely deeply rooted in our theological commitments as Christians.
And as the U.S. leaves an aid vacuum in the wake of the USAID shutdown, what does this enable other world actors like China or Russia? What does that allow them to do? And in what ways does it change world order?
Well, we're already getting some reports. I mean, we'll just have to see what happens because this is all still quite new. But we're already getting reports of China offering some places like, you know what, you had USAID funding, we will come and help. So we've heard reports about this happening in Nepal. We've heard reports about this happening in Colombia. I'm sure this is happening many places that we don't know about because China is not necessarily going to tell us everything that they're doing. I looked at some documents from the Select Committee on the Chinese Communist Party, which is a select committee of the House of Representatives, and they estimate that the Chinese Communist Party and its entities have spent about $1 trillion on development projects in the last 20 years. We know that China is spending a lot of money in this space. A lot of it's in infrastructure development, but there also is some spending in more like humanitarian assistance. We know that they're out there spending a lot of money. They're trying to forge alliances. And China's definitely, as I could say, sort of one of our biggest enemies. This is a country that we're worried about having dominating the world, and we don't really like their values and would rather our values be more dominant. So we're concerned about that, I would say. If indeed the U.S. stops giving humanitarian assistance, other people will probably fill in the gap, but it could lead to a shift in alliances, especially for developing countries. Many have seen us as a friend, they've seen us as an ally, they want to be trading partners, they want advice from us. Recent moves going to go against this suggest that maybe the U.S. can't be a consistent partner. Maybe they should look for someone else who would be more reliable.
And I know that you have some personal experience with the implementation of PEPFAR in the early 2000s. What are your thoughts on freezes regarding HIV medication, as well as the story of how Wheaton College came to be involved with the original implementation of PEPFAR?
So Wheaton College has a really fun place, I think, in the story. We are not remotely instrumental, but we were able to come alongside. So this goes back to 2002. The lead singer of U2, Bono, was on a tour that they called the Heart of America tour, and they had this big tour bus. Bono was on it. The actress Ashley Judd was a part of this. They had a children's choir, and they were kind of going from college to college across the Midwest, and Wheaton College was on the list. I don't know for sure why we're on the list, but I wouldn't be surprised if we were on the list because of Michael Gerson, who was an advisor to President Bush, very interested in Africa policy and a Wheaton grad. But in any case, they came and they had this event, and it was a fabulous event. It was about 2 hours. It was primarily talking about what is the HIV/AIDS crisis? Why does it matter? Why should we care? And Bono did sing a couple songs for us, and Edmund Chapel was completely packed. So after that, there was just a lot of excitement. The students here started a Student Global AIDS Campaign chapter. We were the first evangelical college to have a chapter of this organization. They later hosted a national student conference for Christian colleges that were starting chapters. They had letter writing campaigns going on. The students met with our local member of Congress, Henry Hyde, who had a lot of power at the time. So all of this is happening, and as a department, back in the poli-sci department, we cared about this too. We had had interactions with Michael Gerson. We knew him to be someone who cared about these issues as a fellow alum and someone who his Christian faith was really important to him, as was the Christian faith of President George W. Bush. So our department got together. We don't usually do this kind of thing, but we all wrote a letter, and we drafted a letter to Mr. Gerson, the president's then speechwriter and a policy aide, and said, we really think this global AIDS thing is a big deal. We think the U.S. should be doing more to fight the global AIDS pandemic, that we really need to be a big partner in this. And all of us signed the letter. And for me, it was kind of fun. We don't all necessarily talk about our particular politics like in our classes or whatever, but the group of us, some of us were Republicans, some of us were Democrats. So this bipartisan group of faculty from a lot of different theological perspectives as well, signed the letter, sent it off. And then I don't know exactly how long it was, but I'm pretty sure that Mike got in touch with Mark Amstutz, who then would have been the department chair, and he just said, I got your letter, thank you. You should probably be watching this speech this week. And it was right before the State of the Union. And the State of the Union in 2003 was the speech in which Bush announced his plan for what would become PEPFAR, Presidential Plan for Emergency AIDS Relief. And so Bush goes to a joint session of Congress in that State of the Union. He says, this needs to happen. We need to do this. This kind of thing would need to be an act of Congress, and indeed it was passed as an act of Congress. And it's a really long, complicated, process to explain PEPFAR, but basically what PEPFAR did is it created a program to provide, like I said, that emergency, let's deal with the global AIDS problem. Most of the money went to the African continent. Some money also went to Haiti. And it was a combination of working with drug companies to provide antiretrovirals, working with drug companies to provide antiretroviral drugs at a price that was more affordable. We started to have these drugs. If you had AIDS, if you started taking these medicines, it would extend your life. If you didn't have these medicines, you would die. But they were super, super expensive. And so partnering with drug companies to say, how can we do this at a scale that you can provide them at a much cheaper rate if we're giving them to people for free? And so things like this, partnering with local communities, we estimate now at the 25th anniversary of PEPFAR, they estimated that more than 25 million people's lives were saved by this program. It has morphed some over the years, but it has continued until very recently.
Wow, that is a lot. I've talked to faculty at Wheaton College who said that it was just unbelievable to them that the program has gone this long and helped this many people. It was unimaginable at the time, at the conception.
I was talking with a former student of mine who works in the sort of humanitarian aid space, and she was at an event celebrating the 25th anniversary of PEPFAR just last year. And she said she was sitting at a table with a group of people, and they were saying, we can't imagine that anything like this could happen in this political moment. And this was last year. Just a sense of that you would have bipartisan consensus. This was a big deal. We're spending a lot of U.S. money over on the African continent why are we doing that? And the people are saying, you know what, there's a reason. So it's amazing to me that we were able to make it happen and that it's been sustained this long. But I think it's a really good example of bipartisan cooperation to deal with something that was absolutely destroying the African continent. And without this, it's just so hard to even know what would happen. But to think about the lives that have been saved, the families that have been maintained, there were so many orphans. And then, of course, in the economic development and the businesses and all of this that come when you save 25 million lives, so you have that many more people that are contributing in your country.
Just a little pivot here. I would love to focus on the aid itself. We talked a little bit at the beginning, sure. And so I'd just love to know, where does this aid go, and what is the accountability, the measures for accountability in the government when this aid is distributed?
We hear talk of fraud, waste, and abuse a lot, and I think it's in many ways right to have that conversation, because when you have billions of dollars going places, you want to know that it gets the right place. And people at USAID would tell you that it's not perfect and that the money is not always going where they want it to go. But they do have sort of layers of protection in place. The first layer would be USAID staff themselves. Many USAID staff were overseas in the countries where they were working. So when they have USAID staff in country, those staff members, part of their job would be to make sure that the money was going where it was supposed to, sort of program evaluation, that kind of thing. They also had two other oversight programs in place, one that they call TPM for third-party monitoring. And the idea here, in high-risk countries where we wouldn't have USAID staff in country, in those places they would hire third parties to do that same work, to monitor. So you would hire people in country to see what was going on and to report back, to try to see that the aid was working well, to keep people accountable. And then they also have another program that they call partner vetting. And in certain places where there's a lot of terrorist activity and a lot of operations are going on through terrorist organizations, there would be this extra layer of accountability to try to make sure that the programs in those countries were not connected to a terrorist organization. So different layers of accountability. And then there's also an additional layer that we have in many government agencies, and USAID would be one of them, have what we call offices of the inspectors general. An inspector general is someone who's going to conduct investigations and audits. They're going to be looking for potential fraud, waste, abuse, malfeasance, this kind of thing. Anyone can send a request to an IG and say, we're like sort of whistleblower, we're concerned about problems in this particular program. But they are going to look into problems that are brought to them, issue reports, and make recommendations. So there was an inspector, the inspector general has recently been fired at USAID, but there was a person in an office at USAID. And then one more layer we have is something called the Government Accountability Office, which is actually an arm of Congress, and the GAO is kind of like our internal auditors in the government. So any member of Congress can say, we want an audit on the PEPFAR program, or we want to see what's going on with, you name the program around the world. And then GAO staff would look into it to make sure that a program was achieving what the goals of the legislation. So sort of doing that audit to make sure. So we have lots of measures of accountability. They're not perfect, but there are many, many measures of accountability built into the system. One of the sad things I think that's going on right now, as so many people have been fired, most of the people that provide the accountability to look for fraud, waste, and abuse are no longer there. That inspector general was fired, and I believe almost all the staff in that office as well. So the measures that we had in place, at least for USAID, are not currently in place.
What are the checks and balances in the government? How are these processes currently being bypassed or violated? Your thoughts?
And there have been a lot of questions about this with the Trump administration coming in and making lots of really quick changes. It's not something that we normally see. When we talk about the American government and we talk about checks and balances, it kind of starts with this idea of separation of powers. So we have three branches of government that are each distinctly separate, but neither who can act much on their own. So they're checking and balancing each other. The legislative branch makes the laws and then has the power of the purse. So all money has to come from the legislative branch. We then have the executive branch, which of course is headed by the president, that enforces and implements the laws. So once a law passes Congress, is signed by the president, the executive branch has to figure out how to carry it out and write the regulations based on those laws. And then off the side, we have the judicial branch, which is interpreting the laws. The judicial branch is going to determine if someone's violating a law. They're going to determine if a law or a particular practice is unconstitutional. So when we talk about checks and balances, what we're saying is the executive branch does its thing, the legislative branch does its thing, the judicial branch does its thing, but they're all kind of have some overlapping powers. So probably the best example would be writing legislation. When we think of a law, laws are written by Congress, they are passed by Congress, and then they have to go to the president for the president's signature. So anything that becomes U.S. law has to go through this system where the president has a say. Courts then have a check as well, a check and balance on a law. If a law is unconstitutional, the Supreme Court can say that's unconstitutional, and then the law is nullified. So there's kind of this push and pull that we have with checks and balances. When we talk about something like USAID, you can kind of see the separation of powers and checks and balances working here. USAID was created by an act of Congress, and since it was created by an act of Congress, only an act of Congress should be able to shut down the agency completely. The frozen monies that have been frozen, at least temporarily, we're not sure for how long, were authorized by and appropriated by Congress, and then the president, then President Biden, signed that authorization and appropriation. So USAID entered into contracts that they were in now under last year's budget that had the law that set out our budget. So legally, I would argue those funds need to be dispersed because it's under existing laws. That's kind of how the checks and balances work. There are some ways that the president can work unilaterally, but not that many.
Are the president's actions, therefore, to dismantle the agency legal, and do they violate the Constitution anyway? What is the role of executive order in this checks and balance system?
Sure. Okay. So maybe we'll start with that. An executive order is a power that the president has unilaterally. And so the president can issue an order, issue a directive to the executive branch as the head of executive branch to say, you must do the following. But an executive order has to be within the president's power as explicitly as the head of the executive branch. So, Truman desegregates the military. He had the power to do that because he was the commander-in-chief of the military, and he said we shouldn't be segregated, and it was done. Congress wasn't involved. No one else is involved. That's an executive order. A lot of the actions here, we'll see these actions are going through the court. It seems to me that many, maybe not all, but many of these actions probably aren't within the president's authority so he can't use executive orders to do some of what he's done. Because USAID was created by statute, I would argue that it can only be eliminated by statute. So right now what they've done is they've moved it over to the State Department, and they probably have some authority to do that because right now the USAID is actually under the State Department, sort of in its structure. But the idea of eliminating an independent government agency is just not something that can be done by executive order. It's something that can be done, but it has to be done by an act of Congress. So the president could go to Capitol Hill and say, I'd like this agency eliminated. The bill could be written, it could be introduced, the House and Senate could pass it, and the president could sign it, and then it would be done, and that clearly would be legal. I also think, Paula, what's happening though, technically the USAID is still open. They're kind of moving its operations, but it's still open, but it's been stripped of almost all of the employees. So that's probably not unconstitutional, but it's violating a lot of laws that are in place. We have civil service laws that are in place intentionally to make it difficult to fire government employees. The current laws that we have in place date back over a century, but the idea was concern about political appointees. So a new person being elected, wanting to get rid of everyone and replace them with his or her own patronage hires. And so we wanted a more consistent, stable executive branch that wasn't worried about the political whims of a new president or that kind of thing. So what these laws do then, if it makes it difficult to hire, they're protections that are put in place so presidents can't fire most people for political reasons. The very top political appointees, they serve at the pleasure of the president, so they can be hired and fired as the president chooses. But the vast number of employees at any agency, USAID and others, would have these civil service protections. So there are laws in place, and that's part of what we're seeing right now going through the courts as people are having complaints about violation of civil service law. We're also having complaints about violation of contracts. So their unions, and so we have unionized employees and their contracts, these kinds of things. So all of this is sort of going through the courts now to adjudicate. If the president wants to slash USAID's budget, he actually has power to do that, and that's the budgetary process. But again, kind of our checks and balances, it's no one person. So the president, each spring presents a budget outline to Congress and says, here's how much money I want to spend. Congress then does its part, and then it works through as a piece of legislation, and then it should end up on the president's desk. So the president could say, you know what, we should slash the budget. We're spending $40 billion, let's spend $5 billion. He can put that in. Congress can then say, oh, we love it. Or they could say, actually, let's spend 10 or let's spend 40. So it's going to be a back and forth, but ultimately Congress would then pass the legislation and it would come back to the president. What we've been seeing is kind of skipping over all of those typical processes, just going straight to, I want to slash all of these people. It's just not something that I just historically can't think of an example of this happening, at least in the era of civil service reform.
Looking more at the moral side of things now, how should Christians be involved with politics and government, and what is the theological basis for this?
So that's a really big question. You could write books on this, and actually I have written several books sort of on this kind of larger topic. So I'll give you the short answer maybe. My view is that in our current era, in the time that we live, with the nation states that we have, with the world order that we have, I believe that government is one of the gifts that God has given us to live out the command to love our neighbor. It's not the only way to love our neighbor by any stretch, but government, it has a place in society that is helping us serve that role. And so obviously, I believe when we look at sort of the great commandments, when Jesus is asked for the great commandments, number one is to love the Lord our God with all our heart, soul, mind, and strength, and second is to love our neighbor as ourselves. And so if loving our neighbor is something that we're commanded to do, then I would view government as one of those means to help us live this out. So we don't necessarily think about it so much, but we all rely on government for our daily lives. Our lives would not work without government and the stability that it provides. So we have roads and infrastructure that we don't even really think about. Public safety, maintaining the rule of law, providing a safety net for the poor, all of these things we just take for granted in a highly developed nation like the United States. So when I think about how Christians should be involved in politics and government, I'm thinking they need to be learning about their government, they need to understand how our government works, and they need to be sort of making decisions about that. So government should be there. I think it's super important, but we can, and I think we do, and Christians can and do disagree about the role of government, the scope of government, how big should it be, what should it be doing, what policies are best, what's the best means to achieve this end. All those to me are open questions, and depending on our theological background and even just the way that I think God works in our hearts in different ways and gives different people passions for different issues, I think it's normal for us to sort of disagree on exactly what that looks like. But I think it's actually very hard to argue that we don't need government to maintain order and make space for human flourishing. And we just have to figure out what those policies look like, and I think leave room for respectful disagreement.
And how, as citizens, and at least in my own case, college students, how can we get involved, and how can we do so that our voices are actually heard and can spark change in the right way?
I think, the most important thing where we have to start is we need to start with prayer. And we need to, if there's anything that concerns us, I assure you it concerns God, right? So we need to be praying about these things. And we even have a special form of prayer when we're in a moment where we're concerned, where we think something is problematic. And that prayer is called lament. About a third of the Psalms are Psalms of lament. This is a form of prayer that's been given to us. It actually gives me a lot of hope to realize that Jesus himself prayed a psalm of lament from the cross. So this is something if Jesus can do it, we can do it. So when we follow current events, when we see what's happening, I just think it's really good to pray over current events. And what I do in my classes, when we talk about current events, I always end it with prayer. Bring these things to the creator and sustainer of the universe, share our concerns, and know that those concerns will be heard, and that we serve a loving God. So that's the first step, and an important one. There are also some practical things that we can do. Students, any of us can do. One is, we can reach out to our elected officials. Writing letters works, writing emails works, phone calls work. Letters are nice because you can sort of put into writing specifically what you're wanting, and those letters might be read and make a difference. Phone calls have their own place too because they disrupt the everyday work of legislators, for example. So right now on Capitol Hill, I was just there last week, and hearing from staffers that the offices are being flooded with phone calls. People are upset. When people are upset and start calling, it affects your everyday business. You cannot get away from it. You know something is wrong. So the member's going to say, like, okay, what's going on? What are all those people calling about? And if most of those people are calling about the same thing, it sends a really, really strong message. Your constituents actually care about this. This is not just a little minor issue. And so I think those phone calls can make that difference in that sense of literally you hear the phones and the staff are all distracted because they're having to answer all these phone calls. Interrupting the everyday business is just a good way to signal the intensity of something. But then I think letters and emails are great. Everything that goes into, at least at a congressional office, and I imagine it'd be the same in our state legislatures, is going to be logged. They have a special software for this, and everything is logged in. So they're going to ask a person's name and contact information. If it's a phone call, they're probably just going to write in this person called because they were concerned about USAID or whatever it is. If you send a letter or an email, those also are going to be logged, and then they sometimes are even put in stacks. Like if you have physical letters, you might stack them and say, okay, here's the letters we got this week on USAID. Legislative staff are definitely going to pay attention to those, and members and senators will as well. I'm telling you, say, so what are people saying this week? What does the mail look like this week? What are people concerned about? So it's actually a genuine way of making a difference. Also, voting, it's a thing. It's real. We have federal elections every 2 years. We have other elections more often. And so I do think it's a good thing to vote. And not just to vote, but to spend a little time researching the candidates, learning about their positions so that it's an informed vote is a great thing we can do. If as you are researching the candidates and their positions, like, wow, I really like this guy running for mayor, or I really think this woman who's running for Congress is really, really interesting, then maybe you get involved in the campaigns, and then you help share the information about that person. So there's lots of free things we can do that I think, really make a difference. So investigate, learn enough. If you're going to write a member of Congress, if you're going to write a state legislator, which I think is a great thing to do, know enough about what you're talking about that there's some substance. It doesn't need to be a 30-page letter. It can be just a couple paragraphs, but make it clear, I'm concerned about and I want change, and here's what I want change for. Another thing we can do, which I don't think we do very much, but I think is an awesome idea personally, is that we can also let people know when we like what they're doing. We love to complain. And I'm not sure we'd call people and flood their offices with calls saying you're really awesome because we're wanting them to get their work done. But I've done this, and I think it's a really good thing to do, is say when you see someone standing up for a position that you think is important, send them a letter, send them an email, just say thank you for your support for. Thank you for standing up for. There are not nearly as many people are writing in to say we appreciate what you're doing. Far more the letters are going to be letters of complaint.
Yeah, and I think that the last point that you made is so often forgotten, and I've been trying to do more of that myself, but it's just been a realization, if I were in that person's shoes, saying the things in Congress to the entire floor, to its broadcast nationally, standing up for something, it would be really nice to have someone let you know that what you're saying is appreciated.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Before we have a quick break, I would love to know, is there anything else you'd like to add that I did not mention?
I think we've talked about lots of good things. I know you have questions from your audience, so I'd love to get to those.
We will return to Dr. Black in a moment. I want to thank you for listening to this episode and supporting our work. If you have found what you've heard interesting or insightful, please consider sharing this episode with a friend. Your support is what makes this show possible. Now, back to Dr. Black.
I would love to learn more about not only the ways that USAID has been helpful to many communities around the globe, but where the money is going to during the freeze, especially because there have been so many governmental funds cut in many areas. I'm concerned about where these things are going, especially if they're doing such good work around the world.
No, I mean, simply it's hard to know exactly where the funds are going. I can say this: when money is authorized and appropriated, then that money is sent to the particular department, agency, etc., as part of the federal budget process. So those allocations are made, the money goes. So in the case of what we've been talking about with foreign assistance, money would go to the State Department, which then has a big account that would then go to USAID. So the money has been given. So if the money is not being spent, it is probably sitting in that account. If it's not, there would be legal problems. So it's probably sitting in this account. At the end of a fiscal year, any money that is not spent goes back to the federal treasury, just goes back to the budget. You will sometimes hear of a president sort of moving money around a little bit from one program to another, and the president would have some authority to do that as the head of the executive branch, but you wouldn't have money sitting at USAID and then all of a sudden it's going to, I'm not even sure what program it would be. So it goes over to Health and Human Services. That's not how the accounting works. So if it's not being spent, it probably would go back into the federal treasury.
And I have heard from various reporting that there are plans to put the money from USAID into an American investment program. The details are still a little vague for that, but specifically for American economic investment abroad.
And that's the kind of thing that would be probably adjudicated in the courts. So when money has been appropriated, it's by federal law that money has been given for particular purposes. It's not completely impossible, but it's very difficult to move money to a new thing. On the other hand, if the president wants to do a new thing, if he wants to create this new, goes to Congress, asks for the money. If they say yes and he signs the bill, he has the money.
Okay, for the next question.
My question is how effective all the letter writing campaigns actually will be, especially when Trump's been kind of doing whatever he wants with his executive orders. I'm just wondering, is there actually hope that things can change?
So it's very hard to say. I'm not sure that a letter writing campaign right now to President Trump would make much of a difference. As I watch him in his first term, and so far in this second term, he just doesn't seem to be someone who is acting particularly directly based on what he perceives to be public opinion. On the other hand, I do think there are levers that make a difference. So like we talked about earlier, writing letters to members of Congress, calling members of Congress, telling them, raising your concerns makes a difference for a couple of reasons. We'll start with the most kind of like, I don't know, it's kind of ugly, but true. They're up for re-election far sooner than anyone else. So they will be up for re-election in the fall of 2026, and they know they've got to go to the voters. And if the voters are angry, they could kick them out. So there's that natural inclination. They want to be re-elected. They want to continue in their jobs. So they're going to potentially be more responsive. I think it's also just the case that, again, the president can do a lot of what he wants, but if he begins to get, if he gets pushback from a reporter, he's not going to care. But if he's hearing from Speaker Johnson, if he's hearing from Majority Leader Thune, this is not working, our constituents are unhappy, we cannot do this, that matters. That's going to happen often in back rooms, but that's going to matter in a different way maybe than an individual letter that you might write to the president. Although, I'd say go for it. But those letters, this communication with their members of Congress, so your members of the House and Senate, can build the kind of pressure that could then lead those elected officials to put pressure on the president. I think that's probably the mechanism that would be the most likely to make a difference.
The next question, I'm going to give a couple of questions just because they were very close together. I think you can answer them both at once.
So how did we get here? How is Trump able to do all of this? What is true and what's not true? I've heard various things about what is happening to USAID.
I'm just interested in learning about the legality of what's going on and which actions would be considered constitutional or not.
So yeah, how did we get here? Good question. Super complicated. I mean, part of how we got here is President Trump very much has an America First agenda, and he campaigned in part on that. And so I think he can make the argument that this is part of his mandate. He won the election, he won the popular vote and the electoral college. He did not get 50% of the popular vote. It was a narrow popular vote win, but so he can say he has some sort, I wouldn't call it a strong mandate when you get less than 50% of the vote. That doesn't seem like a strong, it's like a mandate that people want this. We need to care about America first. We need to pull back, and he has a pretty isolationist view of a lot of things. So this very much fits with his policies. So that's maybe kind of how we got there. Now, can he do this is a much bigger question, one we've been talking about a little bit, and imagine you'll be talking about more on this podcast. Can he do this in the sense of, can he issue an order and it stops things temporarily? Absolutely. But can he legally do this? Does he have the authority to do this? Is this constitutional? Much bigger, much more complicated questions, and those are questions that are going to have to be adjudicated in the courts. There's a running list I looked at last week, and I'm not even sure how many was on it, but we're probably up to over 100 now court cases, different court cases that are questioning the legality or the process or the constitutionality of the president's actions, and we're beginning to see things. So there was, a USAID related ruling that made it all the way to the Supreme Court already, at least temporarily, having to do with with one thing, with a temporary restraining order saying you can't stop certain programs. So we're beginning to see this contested in the courts. The problem is the courts are slow. I should say the problem. The courts are slow. I want to say it's a problem because I'd like to see these things resolved more quickly than less quickly, because human lives are at stake, and so it does feel like the stakes are super, super high. On the other hand, I do want judges to be people who make considered decisions, that they weigh the information, that they gather information, and that's a process that takes time. So with a lot of this, I think we just have to be patient and wait and see what the courts do. And we also have to realize that not only are the courts dealing with this, but we've got 3 layers in our federal judiciary. So we've got the district courts, and then we have the courts of appeal, and then we have the Supreme Court. And in some of these cases, we have other adjudicating bodies like the labor relations boards. There's all of these different bodies out there that could adjudicate these claims. They will adjudicate the claims. It's just going to take a long time.
Why is there such a push to eliminate issues relating to DEI and critical race theory, and eliminating the needs of USAID? And why isn't the 90-day foreign aid suspension lifted immediately?
Okay, so we got a couple things going on there. So maybe I'll start with the last part and then come back to the DEI stuff. So why isn't the 90-day suspension of aid lifted immediately? So what the president did in this and other executive orders, as he kind of the work of Doge, they said, we're just going to stop everything for 90 days so we have time to review. We want to see if these policies align with the administration. That's an unusual tactic. Normally that tactic would be, this has been appropriated, we're going to watch, we're going to see what's aligned, and then if we don't like it, we're going to work to change it. So this 90-day suspension of something that's already been appropriated is the kind of thing that's being adjudicated in the courts. And like I said, we've seen some courts are like, you can't do that. You can't freeze the funds. With the case of USAID, the courts have ruled that some of these funds need to be unfrozen and others they need to be dispersed. PEPFAR, other programs like this are needing those funds. Anything that sort of is in this sort of emergency sort of situation, those funds are supposed to be dispersed. However, if you've fired most of the employees and it's really difficult to disperse the funds because you don't necessarily have the mechanisms in place to do that anymore. So what we're hearing on the ground, a lot of these programs that did get government funding, even though the government's supposed to be funding, and even though I think they're trying to fund, there are so many procedural problems that have been created that it's difficult to get the money out there quickly. So programs that have some that rely on financing outside of government are much more able to continue their work while they wait on the government monies to come as well. Question also, you asked a little bit about sort of the DEI programs, and that's a whole nother sort of line of questioning. But one of the things that President Trump has done is he's issued executive orders saying that the government should no longer have programs that these diversity, equity, inclusion programs, and where there are such programs in place within agencies, he's shutting those down. That's probably something he can do because it's within an agency. Depending on the funding, if it's part of an agency that's created by statute, he can't eliminate it. But if it's not created by statute, if it's just created by policy within an organization, those kinds of offices can be eliminated, just as those offices can be created or recreated. So I do think some of what we have seen with this particular line of executive orders, I wouldn't be surprised if we see some of those offices, or at least those kinds of programs, reestablished whenever a Democrat wins office.
Okay, and I wanted to close with this last question just because I really, really like where this person was coming from.
How, as Christ followers, do we see both sides of the political story while keeping our eyes on Jesus' side of the story?
I love that idea of keeping our eyes on Jesus' side of the story. This idea of how do we as Christ followers see both sides of the story? Good question, but one thing I guess I would just say is that sometimes we sort of look at things as if it only has two sides, because we have two parties. So in the United States, we kind of think about things having two sides. I would say, how, as followers of Christ, can we see the many sides of the story? And again, both sides of the story is exactly what you're told to do. So the questioner makes good sense there. I think one of the things that we need to be doing is staying informed and sort of trying to understand what's going on. And so you talk to experts, you do things like have a podcast and bring on, I'm an American politics person, but you can probably bring on better experts than me, but you bring on experts and you talk to them. I think it's important that we follow the news. It's really complicated in today's hyper-partisan environment. I'd say stay away from cable news talk shows because they're not going to be very helpful. It's just entertainment shouting matches. But looking at good news reporting, it's not the most interesting reading, but I think services that are trying to provide basic facts to lots of newspapers around the country tend to write the stories pretty straight. So I think that's a place we can go. Normally, I would say go to government websites as well to learn about things. It's kind of a problem right now because a lot of government websites have been shut down, but you can get to things through Google searches, and I absolutely love the Wayback Machine because there's an organization that basically is storing old versions of websites, so you can actually still get to a lot of government websites through the Wayback Machine. So if we are if we're keeping ourselves informed, then I think we're able to see different sides of a story better. Another way to see both sides, different sides of a story, is to talk to people that you know disagree with you. And I think that's really important, to open spaces where we can have honest, meaningful disagreement. And so part of like, okay, so I oppose these current actions. You support these actions. Let's talk about that. Tell me where you're coming from. And so we have these conversations. We ask people, we invite people to tell us their story, to explain where they're coming from, and we listen. We don't interject. We just listen. And then maybe we have an opportunity to tell our version of events, our view of things, and then we can have a conversation. I think we need to be doing more of that. You talked at the beginning of this podcast about our call to love for neighbor. If we want to love our neighbors, we have to listen to them and we have to understand them. It doesn't mean we have to agree with them. Following Christ and sort of a Christian view of politics does not mean we all have to agree, but it does mean that we need to be respectful of one another, that we need to listen to one another. And so I think that's a really good way. And when we sort of like, what is Jesus' side of the story? It's kind of interesting. If we go back to the New Testament days, he was living in the middle of, not surprising, divisive politics. Probably the most divisive politics at his time were over taxes. And he had a tax collector, and then he has someone on the other side of the debate, part of his disciples, right? So he is reaching out. So Jesus' work transcended the everyday politics of his time, and he seems to have, we often see the Pharisees trying to goad him into these political debates, and him kind of moving his way out of there, because he was there for something. I think political science is kind of important. I've kind of devoted my life to it. I think government's pretty important, but I would argue that Jesus' kingdom is far more important than anything like this. So Jesus is always trying to point people to the true kingdom, the kingdom of God, the final kingdom, the new heavens and the new earth, where everything will be perfect. So as we are debating, discussing, trying to understand, we want to be informed. We want to listen to one another. We want to pray, and I think we just also have to remember that The world is not our home, and we're living in that weird time between Jesus' resurrection and the coming of the new heavens and new earth, and it's not going to be perfect, and we're just going to try to be faithful as we can in the midst of that.
Well, thank you so much for being on the podcast today. It's been a real pleasure.
It's been lots of fun, and I'm excited about your work.
And that's all for this episode. Thank you so much for listening. If you've enjoyed this episode, please consider sharing with a friend. Also, if you are interested in supporting the push for U.S. humanitarian aid to be reinstated, please call your representative and senators. I will leave the resources to do so in the description. Thanks for listening. See you next time.